They stripped him of his command and called him a coward. But what this general did next would save 338,000 men from certain death and change the course of history forever. May 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk, France. The entire British army is trapped with their backs against the sea. German tanks are closing in from every direction. Hitler's forces are just hours away from wiping out Britain's military in one devastating blow. But there's one man standing between total destruction and what would become the greatest military evacuation in history. His name is General Harold Alexander, and this is the story of how brilliant planning under impossible pressure turned a catastrophic defeat into a miracle. Let me paint you a picture of just how bad things were in May 1940. The German blitzkrieg had torn through France like a hot knife through butter. The French army, considered one of the strongest in the world, was collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force, over 300,000 soldiers, had been pushed all the way back to the coast. They were surrounded on three sides. Behind them was the English Channel. In front of them, the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. General John Gord, the commander of British forces, had made the controversial decision to retreat to Dunkirk instead of trying to break through the German lines. Many in London were furious. Winston Churchill himself was skeptical. The British government was preparing for the worst. They expected to save maybe 30,000 men at best. The rest would be killed or captured. But here's where Harold Alexander enters the picture. Alexander wasn't your typical general. While other officers loved the spotlight and craved recognition, Alexander was different. Quiet, methodical. Some people even mistook his calm demeanor for weakness. Throughout his career, rivals had whispered behind his back. They said he was too soft, too cautious, not aggressive enough for modern warfare. They had no idea what he was actually capable of. Born in 1891 into an Irish aristocratic family, Alexander had been a soldier his entire adult life. He'd fought in the trenches of World War I, where he'd learned hard lessons about the cost of poor planning and rushed decisions. While other young officers dreamed of glorious cavalry charges, Alexander had watched thousands die in muddy fields because their commanders didn't think things through. Those experiences shaped him. He became obsessed with preparation, with details, with making sure every decision was based on solid reasoning rather than emotion or ego. His fellow officers found this boring. They wanted action, not endless planning meetings. They wanted bold moves, not careful calculations. Alexander's reputation suffered because of this. People thought he lacked the fire needed for leadership. They thought he was too academic, too detached. But the soldiers who served under Alexander saw something different. They noticed that units under his command had lower casualty rates. They noticed that his plans usually worked. They noticed that he never sent men into situations without thinking through every angle first. The soldiers trusted him, even if his fellow generals didn't. When Alexander arrived at Dunkirk on May 27th, the situation was even worse than reported. The town was burning. German artillery was pounding the beaches nonstop. Luftwaffe bombers filled the skies. Thousands of soldiers were scattered across the dunes, exposed and vulnerable. Ships were being sunk in the harbor. Chaos was everywhere. The scene was absolutely hellish. Bodies lined the waterfront. Wounded men screamed for help. Equipment lay abandoned across miles of sand. Soldiers, exhausted and terrified, pushed and shoved to get on boats. Officers had lost control of their units. The chain of command had broken down. It was every man for himself. And the Germans were getting closer every hour. German General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions were within striking distance. His tanks could have rolled onto those beaches and massacred everyone. The Luftwaffe had almost complete air superiority. British and French fighters were trying their best, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Most generals would have panicked. Most would have grabbed whatever men they could and run for the boats. But Alexander did something completely different. He started planning. Alexander's first move was to establish order out of absolute chaos. He divided the beach into sectors. Each sector got a commander. Each commander had specific responsibilities. Soldiers weren't allowed to just rush the boats anymore. They had to form organized lines. First come, first served was over. Now there was a system. But organizing wasn't enough. Alexander knew that systems only work if people follow them. And these weren't ordinary circumstances. These were desperate men who'd been marching and fighting for weeks. They'd seen their friends die. They'd been bombed and shot at constantly. Their nerves were shattered. Their discipline was hanging by a thread. So Alexander did something that showed his understanding of human nature. He made sure every soldier could see the boats. He positioned the queues so that men waiting in line could watch ships arriving and departing. This gave them hope. It proved that evacuation was actually happening. It wasn't just empty promises from officers. It was real. He also established a strict no-pushing policy. Military police enforced the queues. Anyone who tried to jump the line got sent to the back. This sounds harsh, but it was necessary. Once you let one person break the rules, everyone breaks the rules. The whole system collapses. Alexander understood this. But here's the genius part that most people don't know about. Alexander realized that just organizing the beach wasn't enough. The Germans were getting closer every hour. If the evacuation took too long, they'd be slaughtered. So he needed to buy time. Lots of it. He established a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk. A ring of British and French troops who would hold the line no matter what. These men knew they might not make it out. They were sacrificing themselves so others could escape. The perimeter stretched for miles. It covered the roads, the canals, the villages around Dunkirk. Alexander personally selected the positions. He studied maps for hours, identifying choke points where small forces could hold off larger ones. He positioned artillery to cover the most likely German approach routes. He made sure communication lines stayed open so he could shift troops to wherever pressure was greatest. Alexander personally visited these defensive positions every single day. He looked soldiers in the eye. French soldiers were trapped at Dunkirk too. Thousands of them. And the French command was furious because they felt like the British were abandoning them. French General Fagald accused the British of only caring about saving their own men. The alliance between Britain and France was on the verge of collapse right there on the beach. This was a nightmare scenario. France and Britain needed each other. If the alliance fell apart, Hitler won. Simple as that. But the situation was incredibly tense. British soldiers had watched French units collapse during the retreat. Some blamed the French for the disaster. French soldiers resented being pushed to the coast by a German army that seemed unstoppable. Everyone was looking for someone to blame. Alexander had to manage this political nightmare while also running a military evacuation under constant attack. Lesser men would have cracked under this pressure. He met with French commanders personally. He listened to their complaints. He acknowledged their anger. He didn't make excuses or try to shift blame. Instead, he made a promise to the French. For every British soldier evacuated, a French soldier would go too. 1 for 1. He put it in writing. He gave his word as an officer. The French commanders didn't believe him at first. They thought it was just talk, something to calm them down in the moment. But Alexander kept his promise. Even when it slowed down the evacuation, even when British officers complained, even when it put more men at risk, he maintained that ratio because he understood something crucial. This war was bigger than one battle. Britain would need France as an ally. Trust mattered. He assigned specific sectors to French troops. He made sure they got equal access to boats. He sent British military police to protect French queues from British soldiers who tried to push ahead. He coordinated with French officers daily, keeping them informed of every decision. This wasn't just good politics. It was good military strategy. The French troops holding parts of the perimeter fought harder because they knew they weren't being abandoned. They trusted that if they held the line, they'd get their chance to evacuate. That trust translated into determination, and that determination bought crucial hours. Now let's talk about the boats. You've probably heard about the little ships of Dunkirk. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, private vessels that sailed across the channel to help with the rescue. It's a beautiful story, and it's true. But here's what most people get wrong. Those little ships didn't just randomly show up. Alexander coordinated with the Royal Navy to organize this civilian fleet. The Royal Navy had put out a call for any vessel that could cross the channel. Hundreds responded, but without coordination, they would have been useless. Boats would have gone to the wrong places. They would have gotten in each other's way. They would have been sitting targets for German bombers. Alexander designated shallow water zones where small boats could pick up soldiers and ferry them to larger ships waiting in deeper water. He created a shuttle system. He established communication protocols. He made sure boats weren't wasted or sent to the wrong locations. He divided the beach into loading zones based on water depth. Shallow areas for small boats, deeper areas for larger vessels. The famous mole, a long breakwater extending into the sea, became a priority loading point because ships could tie up directly to it. But the mole presented its own problems. It was narrow. It wasn't designed for heavy foot traffic, and it was a prime target for German bombers. Alexander stationed engineers on the mole to repair damage constantly. He posted medical personnel to treat wounded soldiers on the spot rather than having them clog up the evacuation flow. He timed boat arrivals to minimize crowding. Every single detail was planned. He also had to deal with the tides. The English Channel has strong tides. At low tide, soldiers had to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water to reach boats. At high tide, boats could come closer to shore, but there was less beach space for queuing soldiers. Alexander studied tide charts and adjusted the evacuation schedule accordingly. More boats at high tide, more organization and queuing at low tide. And then there were the Luftwaffe attacks. German bombers hit Dunkirk around the clock. The screaming sound of Stuka dive bombers became constant background noise. These planes were designed to terrorize. They had sirens that wailed as they dove. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers would panic and scatter when they heard that sound. Ships were sinking. Men were dying on the beaches. The smoke from burning oil tanks was so thick it turned day into twilight. The town itself was almost completely destroyed. Buildings collapsed. Fires raged out of control. The smell of smoke and death hung over everything. Alexander used that smoke. He noticed that when the wind blew the smoke over the beaches, German accuracy dropped. Bombers couldn't see their targets as clearly. Artillery couldn't adjust fire as effectively. So he started timing evacuations to match the smoke cover. When visibility was worst for the Germans, that's when the most boats came in. When the smoke cleared, Boats stayed back, and the defensive perimeter absorbed the attacks. He was reading the battlefield like a chess master reads a board. Alexander also coordinated with the RAF to maximize fighter coverage. British Spitfires and Hurricanes couldn't stay over Dunkirk constantly. They had to fly from bases in England, which limited their time over the beach. So Alexander timed major boat movements to coincide with RAF patrols. When British fighters were overhead, that's when the largest vessels approached the mole. This required constant communication between Alexander's headquarters, the Royal Navy, and the RAF. Radio operators worked around the clock passing messages. Schedules had to be updated constantly as situations changed. It was a logistical nightmare, but Alexander's staff made it work because he'd trained them to think systematically. But Alexander's greatest challenge was still ahead. As the evacuation continued, the defensive perimeter had to shrink. There were fewer men to hold the line. The Germans were pushing harder. The risk of collapse increased every hour. This is where Alexander's genius really shone. He established a withdrawal schedule. Units would pull back in stages, leapfrogging each other. The front line would retreat to a secondary position. The secondary position would become the new front line. Then they'd repeat, over and over, shrinking the perimeter while maintaining its strength. Military historians still study this withdrawal today. It was almost perfect. The key was timing. Pull back too early, and you expose other units. Pull back too late, and you get cut off. Alexander spent hours calculating distances, march times, and German advance rates. He factored in exhaustion levels of different units. He considered ammunition supplies and artillery support. Each unit got written orders specifying exactly when to begin withdrawal, which route to take, and where to establish their next position. Officers were instructed to maintain radio silence during withdrawal to avoid alerting the Germans. Artillery would provide covering fire at specific times to mask the sound of troops moving. Alexander also rotated units. The most exhausted troops got pulled back first and sent to the beaches for evacuation. Fresher units took over their positions. This maintained the perimeter's fighting effectiveness even as overall numbers decreased. But it wasn't just about moving pieces on a map. Alexander understood that soldiers moving at night through unfamiliar territory while under stress could easily get lost or separated. So he assigned guides. Veterans who knew the area led withdrawal columns. Soldiers tied themselves together with rope to avoid separation in the dark. Officers counted their men constantly to make sure nobody got left behind. The withdrawal happened over several nights. Each night, the perimeter shrank a bit more. Each morning, the Germans woke up to find British and French positions abandoned and new defensive lines established closer to Dunkirk. German commanders were frustrated. They expected the British to collapse. Instead, they faced disciplined resistance every step of the way. Alexander's planning was buying precious time. As May turned into June, Alexander was one of the last British officers still on the beach. He refused to leave until he was certain every man who could be saved had been saved. He walked the empty sectors himself. He checked abandoned positions. He made sure nobody was left behind. His staff begged him to leave. They reminded him that Britain couldn't afford to lose senior generals. They told him he'd done enough. But Alexander wouldn't hear it. He'd promised himself that he wouldn't abandon a single man who could be saved, and he intended to keep that promise. On the night of June 2nd, Alexander sent his famous message to London. Troops embarked. Returning tomorrow. Short, simple, Classic Alexander. But the story wasn't over yet. On June 3rd, the final day of the evacuation, Alexander was scheduled to leave. The last British troops were boarding. The defensive perimeter was about to collapse. German tanks were less than a mile away. You could hear their engines. You could hear German artillery getting closer. The beach was almost empty. Just a few hundred men left. Ships were making their final trips. Alexander was preparing to board when one of his staff officers approached with a problem. And then Alexander got a report that changed everything. A group of French soldiers, about 1,000 men, were still holding a position on the eastern edge of the perimeter. They'd been forgotten in the chaos. Nobody had told them the evacuation was ending. They were still fighting, thinking they were buying time for an evacuation that was already over. These French troops had been holding one of the toughest sectors. They'd faced constant German attacks for days. They'd run low on ammunition and supplies. Many were wounded, but they'd held their ground because they believed in the mission. They believed that their sacrifice was saving lives. And now they were about to be abandoned. Alexander's staff told him to leave them. There wasn't time. The Germans would overrun the beach in minutes. If Alexander stayed, he'd be captured or killed. Britain couldn't afford to lose another general. The risk was too great. These French soldiers were doomed anyway. There was nothing Alexander could do for them except die alongside them. Every logical argument said to leave. Alexander refused. He ordered boats to return. He personally went to the French position to coordinate their withdrawal. He stayed on that beach, exposed to German fire, until the last French soldier was on a boat. Think about what this meant. Alexander knew the German tanks were coming. He could hear them. He knew that if they arrived before he got those French soldiers out, he was dead or captured. His career would be over. His family would mourn him. Britain would lose an experienced general. But Alexander had given his word to the French. He'd promised that no soldier would be left behind as long as evacuation was possible. And he refused to break that promise, even to save his own life. He organized the French withdrawal personally. He positioned the remaining British troops to provide covering fire. He coordinated with the Royal Navy to bring boats in despite the danger. He stood on that beach directing traffic while German shells exploded around him. The French soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. This British general, who could have been safe, was risking everything for them. Some of them were crying as they boarded the boats. They knew what this meant. They knew Alexander was putting himself in death's path for their sake. The evacuation of those final French troops took hours. Hours that Alexander didn't have. Every minute, the Germans got closer. Every minute, the risk increased. But Alexander stayed calm. He kept organizing. He kept directing. He made sure every single French soldier got on a boat. Only then did Harold Alexander board the final vessel leaving Dunkirk. As his boat pulled away from the shore, German tanks rolled onto the beach. Minutes later. That's how close it was. Minutes. If Alexander had left those French soldiers behind, he would have been safe. He would have avoided that risk entirely. But he would have broken his promise. He would have proven the French commanders right when they said the British couldn't be trusted. Instead, Alexander kept his word. And in doing so, he preserved something more valuable than one general's life. He preserved the alliance. He preserved trust between nations. He proved that honor and integrity still mattered, even in the darkest moments of war. When the numbers were counted, the world was shocked. Instead of 30,000 men saved, over 338,000 had been evacuated. British, French, Belgian, and other Allied soldiers. The vast majority of Britain's trained army had survived. Hitler had been robbed of his knockout blow. The planning that saved those 338,000 men didn't happen by accident. It was the result of careful thinking, detailed organization, and ice-cold calm under unimaginable pressure. Alexander's defensive perimeter bought 6 crucial days. His organizational system prevented chaos from becoming catastrophe. His coordination with the civilian fleet maximized efficiency. His promise to the French preserved the alliance. His tactical withdrawal was executed almost perfectly. And most importantly, Alexander understood something that separates good generals from great ones. Details matter. Every decision, no matter how small, had consequences. The placement of a defensive position, the timing of boat arrivals, the treatment of Allied soldiers, the organization of queues, the rotation of troops, the coordination with air support. Alexander sweated every detail. Let me give you a specific example of how much Alexander cared about details. During the evacuation, someone noticed that soldiers were abandoning their rifles on the beach. They were exhausted, and rifles are heavy. They figured they'd get new ones back in England. But Alexander saw this and immediately ordered military police to collect every abandoned rifle. He had them stored on ships and sent back to England. Why? Because Britain didn't have unlimited weapons. Every rifle saved at Dunkirk was a rifle that didn't need to be manufactured. Those rifles would arm the Home Guard and new recruits. That one decision, which most generals would have ignored, ended up maturing months later when Britain was preparing to defend against invasion. That's the level Alexander operated on. He thought 3 steps ahead, always. The men who had called him a coward saw the truth at Dunkirk. Alexander wasn't soft. He wasn't weak. He was just playing a different game. While others chased glory, Alexander chased results. While others made bold gestures, Alexander made smart decisions. While others worried about their reputation, Alexander worried about bringing soldiers home alive. After Dunkirk, Alexander's career skyrocketed. Churchill, who'd been skeptical of Alexander before, became one of his biggest supporters. Alexander was sent to Burma to organize the retreat there, then to North Africa, where he helped turn the tide against Rommel, then to Italy, where he commanded the Allied invasion. At every posting, Alexander displayed the same qualities: careful planning, attention to detail, calm under pressure, and a genuine care for the lives of the men under his command. He was eventually promoted to Field Marshal, one of the highest ranks in the British Army. After the war, he became Governor-General of Canada and then Minister of Defense. He was showered with honors and awards. But he never forgot Dunkirk. Years later, when asked about his greatest achievement, Alexander didn't talk about his victories in North Africa or Italy. He didn't talk about his promotions or his awards. He talked about those 6 days on the beach, about the men who held the line, about the soldiers he brought home. In one interview, Alexander was asked what he learned from Dunkirk. His answer was simple: that good planning saves lives, and that no plan survives without good people executing it. The real heroes of Dunkirk weren't the generals. They were the soldiers who held the perimeter, the sailors who sailed into danger, the pilots who fought against impossible odds. I just tried to organize their courage into something effective. That humility was classic Alexander. He always deflected credit. He always praised others. But the truth is that without his planning, without his organization, without his leadership, Dunkirk would have been a massacre instead of a miracle. There's a military principle that Alexander embodied perfectly: Prior planning prevents poor performance. The 5 Ps. Alexander lived by those Ps. Every decision he made was based on careful thought. Every order he gave was part of a larger plan. Nothing was random. Nothing was left to chance. But Alexander also understood that plans had to be flexible. The situation at Dunkirk changed constantly. Weather changed. German pressure changed. Ship availability changed. A rigid plan would have failed immediately. So Alexander built flexibility into his system. He created backup options. He prepared contingencies. He made sure his subordinates understood the intent behind orders, so they could adapt if circumstances changed. This balance between structure and flexibility is incredibly hard to achieve. Most generals lean too far one way or the other. Either they plan everything down to the last detail and can't adapt when reality doesn't match their plan, or they stay so flexible that there's no real plan at all, just reaction to events. Alexander found the sweet spot. Detailed planning that allowed for adaptation. Structure that included flexibility. That's genius-level thinking. Because that's what great planning does. It saves lives. It turns impossible situations into possible ones. It finds order in chaos. It gives people hope when everything seems hopeless. Harold Alexander proved that genius isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and focused on doing the right thing at the right time. Sometimes genius is recognizing that glory doesn't matter as much as results. Sometimes genius is having the courage to stay on a beach under fire because you promised not to abandon anyone. The general they underestimated became the man who saved an army. The officer they called cautious became the hero who organized the greatest evacuation in military history. The man they thought lacked fire proved that cold, careful planning burns just as bright as hot-headed courage. And that's the real lesson of Dunkirk and Harold Alexander. Brilliance isn't always flashy. Leadership isn't always about stirring speeches and dramatic gestures. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage and intelligence happen quietly, in the careful planning of details that most people never notice. Alexander noticed those details. He planned for them. He executed based on them. And because of that, 338,000 men who should have died or been captured went home to their families. That's the power of great planning under pressure. That's the mark of a true military genius. Watch the next video to see how another general's planning changed everything.